Sorry, it's like, are we cool with the recording? Okay, cool. The topic today is the landscape for arts grants in Illinois, and we have some diverse perspectives on that from our panel, which I'm really happy about. Let me give a quick shout out to Gus Willoughby, the co-founder of the Safer Foundation, who developed Philanthropy Club over 20 years ago, and it is devoted to bridging the gap between larger shops and small shops in Illinois. It's free, and we're always looking for volunteer moderators. So if you're interested, please let us know. I want to thank Forefront for hosting these sessions, as always, providing administrative support, and especially Key Montgomery for just making all the parts move. And just somebody, okay. Just if you could make sure that you're muted. And I'm going to kick it off here by just letting our panel introduce themselves. We have an artist with us, also a founder of an arts organization. We also have a funder. And then we have someone who's worked as an advocate for a long time in the arts field. So I think these are perspectives that altogether kind of paint a picture of where we are with arts funding in Illinois. So Monica, I'm going to let you start us off.
Bonjour, everyone. Can you hear me okay? All right, good. Wonderful. I'm Monica Rickert-Bolter. I'm Prairie Band Potawatomi, Black and Czech. And I'm one of the co-founders for Center for Native Futures, also director of operations, and one of the visual artists on display there. I am Chicago-based, obviously. And yeah, I've been doing art since I can remember, and I didn't always stay with that path because it didn't seem like you could really make a living as an artist, or just not necessarily seeing them get funded, or women artists also being elevated the way men were. So there was a lot of back and forth with that, and then I got involved with more nonprofit work, especially with the Native American community here in Chicago. And it's just been really wonderful. And, just got connected with some fellow artists, Deborah Yeppa-Papan, Chris Papan, Andrea Carlson. And, we had this vision, like, okay, we know that the landscape here isn't exactly great for Native arts, especially for contemporary Native arts. And a lot of people don't even realize that Native people are still alive in Illinois. We're hoping to change that narrative. So yeah, that was definitely a need and a push, and another reason for Center for Native Futures to even get established. So yeah, just letting you know that there's definitely some challenges that we're still seeing when it comes to arts funding, particularly for individual artists. Sometimes it's like group projects, or like, oh well, what are you doing with this organization, as opposed to, can you meet all the qualifications to receive these smaller grants for, you just creating your own art. And a lot of times people want a final product, but sometimes you need that time to think. Artists don't always get paid on time. So that's also something that people just say, you're just out there hustling constantly. And it's really nice to finally be at a point where you don't have to hustle. And I'm hoping that the landscape will change for artists, so you don't always have to feel like that, where you can just, create and, really get your thoughts and ideas and expressions out there, and, be able to collaborate with more folks. So yeah, maybe if there's more grant opportunities like that, that'd be wonderful. But that's just a little bit about me. I don't want to take up too much more time.
Well, that's awesome. That's awesome. Thank you. Chris, can you go next?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Good morning. I'm Chris Guzaitis. I'm Director of Grants and Awards at the Poetry Foundation. I use she, her pronouns. The Poetry Foundation, I think, is one of the largest funders of poetry in the country. We recently became grant makers in 2022. And because of just the really kind of devastating funding landscape for the literary arts, we're the second largest private funder of the literary arts, after the Mellon Foundation. Prior to working at Poetry Foundation, I worked at Illinois Humanities, where we also did grants as well to humanities and arts and culture organizations. So I'm happy to talk from that perspective as well. And I'm here in Chicago, and yeah, I think that's it for me.
Great. Thank you. Jonathan?
Yes, good morning, everyone. I'm Jonathan VanderBrug. I've been in the nonprofit sector in various roles as an executive director, an outreach director, and organizer for about 25 years. Most recently, I served as deputy director for civic engagement for Arts Alliance Illinois, and my heart is definitely in the arts. My wife is an artist. I do some drawing as best I can, but arts are a great love for me. I have worked in many other fields as well, in healthcare, in social services, even in taxation, and see all those kind of expressed in different ways through creativity in the arts. I currently serve as a consultant working with grant makers and nonprofits, and so it's really good to be here today. And so thanks to the Philanthropy Club. Kerri, am I now in the club? Am I in
Uh,
the club
you're in,
now?
you're totally in. Yeah.
Okay, because I've never really been in a club, so this is kind of cool. So,
I'll let you know all the responsibilities after.
okay, cool.
Thank you, John. Okay, so I wanted to get to our first question, and I was, Monica already touched on this some, so I'm not going to skip her, but I'm going to come back to her. And Chris, could you start us off talking about, from your perspective, the challenges that are facing artists and arts organizations in Illinois around funding right now, into this moment in 2024?
Sure. I would say definitely underfunding is for the biggest challenge facing artists and arts organizations for sure. The arts are, as I'm sure everybody here is aware, are severely underfunded. I had mentioned that, and the literary arts, which I represent, are like the most underfunded of the arts. And so I think that for arts organizations, and it's even more difficult for artists to find funding as individuals. And so it's a really, unfortunately, then that makes it a very competitive field in terms of trying to secure funding, because there are so few dollars for so many folks who are in need of funding. And so I think, trying to think, us as funders, trying to really rally like other folks to give and to really try to increase the amount of funding that's available for the arts is really important. So the kind of advocacy work funders can do amongst themselves and each other. And then also I think there definitely needs to be more support for individual artists. And sometimes funders have difficulty funding individuals or setting up the kinds of systems and processes they need to fund individuals. So I think funders committing to doing more creative things to, like, whether that's funding organizations who could then fund individuals, but always keeping the artists like top of mind, because obviously there would be no arts without artists. So I think for me, like, those are the big challenges, underfunding for sure, and then like funding for individual artists on top of that.
Can you speak a little bit about something we talked about yesterday? What's going on in my head? Oh, we talked about the open call issue, right? Because often when people deal with foundations who have invitation only, people bristle at that because it just feels like a closed door. But I thought it would be helpful if you just talked about, like, and often the defense that, foundations make is it's a staffing issue. We like really just don't have the people to look at all that and sort through all that. So I just wanted you to talk about the challenges of trying to do the open call.
Sure. Yeah, so at the Poetry Foundation, we do have an open an open application process. So as long as somebody who's applying, we only fund nonprofit-based organizations through the grants program, but we have an awards program too. But through the grants program, as long as, you're an organization who's doing poetry programming, you're eligible to apply. And so we get over 200 applications each cycle. And we're a staff of 2 in the grants department. So we rely on external paid community-based reviewers. And so, and those reviewers change from cycle to cycle. So we have 2 cycles a year. And yeah, we only fund probably about 15 to 20% of the applications that come in. And so one of the things I think that's really difficult for us is that we want to maintain an open process and we want everyone to have access to the process, but we also, it doesn't feel great to have to turn away so many people and to have so many folks investing their time and effort in applying and not, and often to everybody, I mean, this is what the external reviewers always say, that there are just so many worthy applicants, but there's just a limited amount of money. And so they have to make really tough choices. And so it's really, I think, a challenge obviously on both ends. I mean, I'm not asking folks to feel sorry for the foundation side of things. But, it is a challenge for us too, just to not necessarily so much of dealing with the volume, but just like, I think dealing with that high level of declines. Like, no one wants to see that. Like, that doesn't make anybody feel good. And so I think one of the things, invitation only, like some folks do make arguments for how that can be a more equitable approach, just because, folks who then are applying have not a guaranteed chance, but certainly a better chance of getting funded than oftentimes in an open application process. But really then it depends, on how foundations go about the invitation process. So for us, like, we're committed to having an open process, but I think, as we think about the future, we're just thinking about how we tighten up guidelines and make things make our priorities even more and more specific, so that we're not necessarily getting everyone's hopes up.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Jonathan, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about current challenges that you see from someone who's been a long time advocate in this area.
Yeah, I'll kind of talk from a really big picture. When it comes to arts and funding, I think the biggest challenge is just sheer uncertainty. The pandemic threw funding models up in the air. And for many performing arts organizations, the audiences are coming back, but they're not at the level that they were prior to the pandemic. And it's throwing funding models, whether they're subscription models or other ways, kind of up in the air. And it's that uncertainty sometimes that is the hardest challenge. And so I think it's a call for us as a sector and as individual arts leaders to try to be as open and flexible to new funding models and to new partnerships, including ones that stretch out across the arts. So certainly that uncertainty is a big thing. Uncertainty is kind of a fuzzy thing. I recognize there are also some larger challenges that are more concrete, policy challenges. And to give you one example of that, the tax reform that occurred in 2017 has had a really big chill. At least initial data is showing a pretty big chill on individual giving. So I know we talked about grants, but individual giving being another leg of the funding table. Just for those of you, just to give you the quick, because all of you want to hear tax policy in the morning, right? That's what people want. But just real quick, it affects the arts, but affects everyone. And that is basically, you can standardize your deductions or itemize your deductions in taxes. And in 2017, they boosted the standard deduction. And that means so many more people are not itemizing their tax deductions now. And that means so many people no longer have access to a charitable tax deduction. You can't say when you're inviting an individual donor necessarily to as many people, you'll receive a tax deduction. So before, about a third of people itemized their tax deductions, and now only 12% do. And all that decrease of that 20% are all people who that tax incentive is now off the table completely. That is a huge challenge. There's some work to try to rectify that. So yeah, so uncertainty, and then some certain policies that are really posing a challenge now. Yeah, those are two big ones.
That's really helpful. Monica, could you just kind of chime in here at the end about, like, I guess was just bringing up to me when I, just like yesterday when I talked to these guys, but I just listened to this, all the institutional pieces. I just am interested if you say, is there any experience with the funder that you've had, or when you started doing that, that was encouraging or made things possible? I'd love to hear that.
Yeah. Actually, so one of our biggest funders for Center was the Terra Foundation for American Art. Ever since the leadership change with Sharon Corwin, I feel like they've really upped their game on trying to be more inclusive and adding more diverse stories and different artworks and arts organizations. So they're actually following through with helping to change the landscape. They also regularly check in and want our feedback. And I've noticed that they've also been reaching out to other groups and organizations. So I think that there's hope, that we will see some positive changes. And then just like the more that these funders can start talking amongst themselves, I think also that can help, shift certain things. But I know change is always a long time coming. It's very slow. But yeah, I think we're definitely seeing some folks that are really putting in the effort and the work.
I wanted to stay with you, Monica, because I wanted to move into the second question about just the importance of attending to the priorities of foundations. And really I think since 2020, since like how things have changed, the focus on racial equity and a lot of the shifting priorities of foundations, and then also the broadening of what counts as art, and all designed to sort of increase eligibility, et cetera. And I was just wondering if you could talk about how have things changed since 2020, and where we know that there's been kind of a backlash in ways, or return to normal, that kind of thing. But I just wonder, how are you feeling about those changes in terms of how you frame your work and how much that's a concern?
Well, so I have a more commercial art background. So I think some of my approaches are a little different, because I'm also like, all right, how are we making that money? How are we, trying to create something that'll be sustainable? But I know a lot of people don't have that background either, where it's like when you're coming with fine arts, like, it's a whole different way that they teach you how to do this stuff. Because really in commercial arts, you take yourself out of the art and it's for the client. So it doesn't really matter what you think, it's just you're producing the work, as opposed to arts where it's like, no, this is all like my expressions and this and that. So that's actually been kind of a shift for me and how I approach things, especially. And then I also have a slight journalism background. So I'm also like, oh, yay, more writing. So, and I know a lot of people aren't always, thrilled to do that. A lot of times if they can just talk about it, or, submit a video or something, people prefer those kinds of options. And, I've also been on the grant reviewer side of things, where I'm looking through all these applications, and sometimes where I'm like, yeah, I mean, like when you open the door to everybody, you open the door to everybody. And sometimes you're like, ooh, they need a little help, or, or you see the folks that are like, oh, they're trying, but they just don't have like the extra know-how, or like, oh, well, you got to include these details or something. So, yeah, I'm not sure if that's just free, like professional development training that needs to happen, where we can see more of that in the kind of shift in the landscape. But yeah, I think at this point, it's just a lot of trial and error, and just try to, when you do get funding, like keep those relationships going with those funders, because it is all about that relationship building. It's very much part of the center's approach on the way we conduct things. And because honestly, we're trying to create best practices when dealing with artists, dealing with organizations, dealing with Native people. And, it's always, hopefully we're not always doing Native 101 and teaching people all these new things, but also showcasing, hey, we're not just stuck in the past. Like there's future, there's presence, there's like the presence right now. And how are we realizing those futures? So it's just, yeah, trying to move forward.
That's really helpful. It's really helpful. Chris, can I ask you to talk about, I guess, how you were impacted by the racial equity focus that a lot of foundations shifted to, and even now, right? Like MacArthur and Field just came out with their latest art, telling us what art is and how they're gonna, who's gonna get it. But it's just interesting because it feels like if you're trying to get grants, you need to watch that stuff. You need to know. And I'm wondering how, you know, someone like Poetry Foundation is affected when well-known arts organizations are sort of setting a priority there for everyone.
Yeah, that's a great question. In terms of just the impact of 2020, I mean, the Poetry Foundation underwent, you know, like a huge transformation. They were called to task in terms of just their history of not supporting poets of color, of really not being good community members. And so we had a total leadership transition. The executive director and the board chair both stepped down. And then that also ushered in for us like a new like grant making program. So we, the Poetry Foundation didn't do grants really officially prior to 2022. They did give money out, but they were primarily an operating foundation. And so, so as a result of new leadership coming on board, our president, CEO, Michelle Boone, like decided to start a grants program. And so now we have actually a grant making program. We get our initial commitment was $3 million a year to the literary arts. And so just to go back on my intro, like the fact that, you know, coming in at $3 million a year, like makes us the second largest funder in the literary arts is really sad, is really, is like, just speaks to how sad the funding, you know, how sad it is for the arts and the literary arts in particular. But also, and so we have a priority category. 60% of our funding goes to BIPOC-led and BIPOC-serving organizations. And so I think when you made the mention, Kerri, of like priorities, that's like paying attention to what foundation's priorities are. I think that's really important. So for us, like that obviously gets communicated to our external reviewers that, you know, our priority is funding BIPOC-led and serving organizations. We have a specific category for that. And then even within our category, that's kind of a more general category, we still prioritize what we call like historically resilient communities that are historically resilient. So BIPOC, LGBTQIA, disability communities. So, you know, oftentimes folks who are maybe in the field and are really expecting that because they're doing, you know, the work around poetry that they should get funded, like they're not necessarily aligned with our priorities or what the priorities of the community reviewers are. And so, you know, we definitely see trends amongst the community reviewers in terms of wanting to fund smaller organizations that have smaller budgets, organizations that don't have the staffing capacity, that are maybe just all volunteer organizations. I think for the community reviewers, they, you know, see those organizations as being kind of the lifeblood of the ecosystem and really needing the support. And so, so yeah, I think that that's really important. And then the other thing to keep in mind is I know we talk a lot about the ways in which like the COVID funding was a big influx into the arts community, and then it kind of started to evaporate. But that really did happen too, like post, you know, George Floyd's murder, there was a big influx of funding that did not stay sustained. So, you know, we have one grantee, for instance, who are a Black-led, Black-serving poetry organization, who said, you know, in the summer of 2020, we had like 170 new individual donors who came on board, and to date, only 20 of those donors are still funding them. And so and then with what we saw with the overturning of affirmative action in 2023, and then the court case that was brought against the Fearless Fund, you know, that has already started to have impact, even though that case hasn't been decided yet. If, you know, this is the case of a venture capitalist firm that gives money specifically to predominantly Black women-led organizations in the form of grants, and a case has been brought against them that they're discriminating by the same folks who brought the affirmative action case against Harvard and UNC. So, so already some, you know, foundations have like immediately taken down all their language about, DEI and investment in BIPOC and BIPOC led, and, out of like an overabundance of like being risk averse and cautious around what we don't yet know what's going to happen. So yeah, I think it's, it's important to kind of keep all of those things in mind, that we still, haven't seen what the overall impact of the overturning of affirmative action is going to be across outside of just universities. So
it's really helpful. Jonathan, I'm going to turn to you, and you can sort of get into this, because we've discussed this in the past about the just like the racial we know that foundations are trendy, right? but the racial equity piece around George Floyd and all of that happened in 2020 is beyond just trendiness. However, how's that playing out, right? Because there is that trendiness rut is there. So I'd be interested to know from an advocacy point of view how this is looking to you.
Well, certainly the emphasis on racial equity is long overdue, centuries and centuries, and it shouldn't take the murder of George Floyd or pandemic to call foundations' attention to it. But whatever the reason, it is a reality. It's a good reality that there's more attention being paid on racial equity. I think my comments mostly, I think, would be to kind of white-led organizations or to predominantly white organizations, that regardless of what the specific foundation you're applying for is looking, that racial equity does have to be center. And I really I think about it in basically kind of three terms, right? Like action, integrity, and process. I think that there are a lot of organizations that see a foundation asking about equity, and the organization just does enough to be able to answer the question in words. Committees are good. Statements are good. Hiring someone to come in and do an audit on racial equity is good. Those are good things, but they're not enough. Ultimately, in your application and when you talk to a program officer, you need to be able to show results. How is the power in your organization shifting? Not just a committee or a statement. How are decision-making processes changing so that people who have been pushed out, people who are ignored, historically marginalized, BIPOC communities, so that they are decision makers? And you have to be able to give concrete examples of that type of action, even if you're failing at it, even if you're not doing it, how are you beginning to actually serve? And we oftentimes as nonprofits in the arts talk about serving a community. Well, service requires a relinquishing of power towards fairness. So I think in applications and when talking to foundations and individual donors, there needs to be an emphasis on that action. And then I think another kind of sub thing that is happening within the arts community in particular that is very good is an emphasis on integrity, that it's not just about showing racial equity and showing integrity in your programs, but how is you as an organization internally showing equity? How do you treat your employees? What policies do you have? Do you pay artists also a living wage when you get them? Do you treat them as employees or just, contractors that come and go? What's your commitment? So that type of integrity. And then towards that end, I think that process is very important. I recently worked on updating the Illinois Arts Learning Standards and had the opportunity to work with arts educators from across Illinois. The biggest monumental change in arts education, as shown in the learning standards, is that arts education is now focused on process, not only grading the painting that the student hands in, but thinking about the process, the actions, all the steps that the student went through in the process of making that, in the process of developing that artwork. That's where learning can take place. And I think if you're an executive director, if you're a development director, not just to look at the grant application that you're submitting, but what was the process that you used to make the proposal? Did you have voices of historically marginalized people be part of that process of determining it, of writing it? That takes more time, it takes more energy, but it will result in an application and a program that has more integrity to it. So this is a really important time now where in the arts community, as in other communities, in the we can it's one thing to be told by a foundation, we want to see racial equity. And predominantly white organizations, we can say, okay, that's a hoop we have to jump through. That's not it. Don't view it that way. If you need to use it, if you're a development director, I think, and you're in an organization where people are skeptical, if you need to use that as a jumping off point, well, this funder wants it, fine. But you have to push to say, we're not just doing this to check an equity box off on an application. This is real. And we have to show this power shift. So I think it's a really good opportunity, regardless of whether it's a trend or not. We can't let it be a trend. So lock it into how you make your proposal and how you submit your application.
I really appreciate that answer, and it makes me think about in terms of grantees not just checking off a box, but when funders are doing that as well. And so I wanted to ask Monica, like, one of the things I've seen, and where I'll just put it straight, where the BIPOC, the use of that actually erases the indigenous folks, where you'll see like, oh, we checked the racial equity box, we checked the BIPOC box, but then you'll see through the course of it that everybody feels good about that, but there was actually no indigenous people represented in that. And that was just really notable to me. It's like, well, this is a little bit of a erasure by acronym, it's like a disturbing. And I just wondered like how you feel about that, or if you feel those kind of terms and that framing has been working for indigenous artists.
Yeah, of course, like at first you're like, oh, they're including indigenous voices, but like you said, oftentimes they get often overlooked, or just not included at all, and that is disturbing to see, and it's unbelievable because it's like we're all on native land. It's always been native land. So it's along the lines of land acknowledgements as well, where those can often come off as very performative and just they're checking off a box. Like, what else are you doing to hopefully like give Native people some land back? Are you doing anything to hire more Native people on staff? And like Jonathan was saying, like, they're becoming the decision makers? Seen it time and time again where people will just hire at least one, and it's like you can't do it alone. That's also way too much pressure that gets put on an individual who's supposed to represent all Native people. And it's like, well, there's over 575 like federally recognized tribes, not including all the state ones. So it's just kind of mind-boggling how just like kind of keep saying the same thing over and over. It's like we just need more and more of our voices there, and in these roles where if I don't know, sometimes it feels like these institutions that were definitely set up through colonization, like you're trying to shift that, but it's like, but is that where you really need to make that change there? Because like that's already in its history, that's already in the background, it's already in the mentality of the employees. Like you can't say stuff against it or to try to criticize or just like helpful critiques, even that. Like you can still love something and still be like, hey, do better. Like think about, I'm sure there's plenty of parents on here. They're like, I love my child, but I need to let them know you got to have some discipline sometimes so you can be a better person and get along with people. So I think it's also just, we're also at a moment in time where we are actually in positions where we can have our own agency. We understand the history of what Native people have gone through, and we just don't want to keep seeing repeats of that happen again. So we're taking what we've learned and trying to see like, all right, well, maybe there's another approach, or maybe if I word it this way, or maybe if I just show you this is what we mean when we say we want more inclusivity, we want more equitable opportunities and different things like that. So it's upward battle.
that's really great. And I wanted to just add to that about, like, so what does it mean for you to found it, for the artists to come together and found a beautiful space in the South Loop? How, I mean, what is, and in the what you have to offer for artists to sort of bypass some of these barriers?
Yeah, so I mean, we're trying to make sure that we're prioritizing artists. Right now, we're only primarily focusing on visual arts and writers and poetry and things. Like we're hoping to, because our space is kind of limited, even though it's beautiful, it's lovely, we're really excited to be down there. There's still limitations. And the type of artists that we can have, like we only have one sink, and it's like, well, we can't have paint down there, and then also, our coffee grounds. So, so there's like definitely some things that we were just like, all right, give and take here and there. But if we can create more events for Native community, a lot of times people feel like they've just been pushed from the loop and don't feel like they have anywhere that they can fit in downtown. And it's wonderful seeing people just coming in to visit, and they're like, what is this Native group? And they get really excited because they've just come off of like Union Station. So we are seeing like Native people being drawn back to the area, and we want to make sure that we're combating certain narratives that, I mean, you see it on all, like many buildings. Like we're located in the Marquette building, and that building alone, has a very problematic mural in the entryway. It's all about the Jesuit priest Marquette coming, discovering the Chicago River with all these people there. And, because it's a historical landmark building, they can't actually change anything. So MacArthur Foundation owns the building, but they did create a committee to address, why the mural was problematic. It got a lot of Native people to offer perspectives and possibilities of how to change. So there is going to be like this intervention space that will become a permanent exhibition with the building. So we're seeing changes like that. And then they also offered, the storefront for our gallery and for our artists. So we do have a studio space, and like part of the thing we're trying to help really uplift local Chicago artists. And we offer a stipend, we pay for material supplies, and we don't charge them any rent for utilizing the space. So, and we try to make the residency long as well. So, we've only been in there for 8 months, but we were also able to partner with Northwestern's Center for Native American or Native and Indigenous Research Center, so CNAIR. And we've hosted 2 artist residencies, and we're also trying to make sure we have multiple exhibitions so we can showcase and feature. Here's what's happening regionally. Here's for people that don't know, that Great Lakes artists have a certain style, like a woodland style, Anishinaabe. Like we want certain word and and language to come back and make sure that people are educated, but also get to experience like, oh, okay, Native people are still here. They're still doing stuff. They're still making art. They're collaborating with other groups, and we try to just keep spreading the word as much as possible.
Thanks, Monica. That's great. Chris, I just wanted could you just weigh in on this about, I'd just like to know how you feel. You were nodding when I was talking about, having somebody come in and tell us, okay, here's what art is now for this current iteration of our strategic plan. I'm just wondering, like, one of the things I talked about with you beforehand or sent you beforehand was this, like, how decision-making is done, and how, if these priorities around racial equity, are you supposed to forward your identity? Like, it's like, I guess I'm just wondering, just any tips you could kind of give us on that, of how this is influencing the field for your perspective.
Yeah, I think, this idea, it's complicated at the Poetry Foundation, I think, because, we also have Poetry Magazine. And for a very long time, I think Poetry Magazine was like an arbiter of like, what is poetry and what isn't. And so I think I think it's difficult anytime there are like larger bodies and power, like trying to dictate like what constitutes the arts. So I think for us, like also part of that open process is seeing like what other folks are doing out there with poetry that's like innovative and that is like, I think some of the stuff that we see that's like the most like compelling is like folks who are doing stuff at like a hyper local level and like really engaging with providing space, like similar to what Monica's saying, providing space for like local artists to like come together and to work on their, work on their craft and practice. And oftentimes these are, like all volunteer led groups who are like specifically serving like, BIPOC populations. And so I think that's like what we feel like is the most compelling. It's like, we're not necessarily then defining like what the art form is. It's like, but we're supporting folks who are at a very hyper local level, like helping to provide space and support for folks in their community to like engage with the arts. And so, I think for us, like that's really important. And that really does seem to align with like what, folks who are community reviewers who are in the community and like what they also want to see funded. And so, yeah, I think that's like one way that we could encourage, I think, like funders to approach, not come from this perspective of they're just like defining. Of course, there's like always definition happening, and like folks in power always define whether or not they're like willing to say it out loud or not. It's like, that's happening. When you look at a roster of like grantees, like and who gets funded, like that's obviously legitimizing like certain groups over others. That's part of that's an unfortunate part of the process. So, but yeah, I think there's ways that funders and working within a participatory context and working with folks in the community can like enlarge rather than like shrink. I mean, it doesn't mean, I know I was talking earlier that having an open process means like everything kind of comes out of the woodwork, but I still think that you could tighten up eligibility guidelines and you could tighten up things while not necessarily limiting like what the definition of the art form is or who gets funded within the art form. We try to think about style a lot too in terms of form, and we want to make sure that experimental poetry is getting funded and supported, and it's not just other like the more typical forms that people recognize and respond to popularly. So yeah, but I think as arts funders, like those are things that we need to always be conscious of.
Okay, that's really helpful. And I want to move into this last question, which I think because I'm hoping if you guys want to start putting questions in the chat that we'll have for our Q&A, that's totally great. And then you can also just ask, of course. But what I wanted to move to is something we talked about yesterday when the four of us got together. And I was listening to, because really, even though there's this designation, like all of you are advocates, right? And we're talking about the importance of advocacy and why. And I was listening to someone say the other day that there's literally no issue in this country where the status quo needs to be changed that doesn't require advocacy. And one of the things I think is clear is that just like so many other, like the arts is underfunded, right? And we rely on private foundations. These various ways artists have to scramble to like, you can't just be an artist and live. You have to like a lot of hoops and stuff. So Jonathan, I thought it would be great if you just cover that piece about what happened during COVID and that aha moment we talked about of like how to look at this.
How long do I have, Kerri? Because
you have like a good 6 minutes.
No, I'm just kidding. You're absolutely right. Funding for the public funding for the arts in the United States is pathetically low. When you look at the NEA, its budget is about 0.003% of the overall government budget, not even a period if you're drawing a graph. The pandemic, though, did show, and I think you brought up this point, Kerri, while we were preparing, that funding for the arts is possible. The money can be found when it's needed. And I think that Yes, they're one-time funds, but it did show that the government, when it wants to, can be active, can find the resources, and can get them to the arts community. When it comes to arts funding, there's no foundation, there's no individual donor that has as big a pocketbook as the federal government, the state government, and even the local government. None. There's also no foundation. This is not minimizing individual donors or foundations. It's showing the unique part of advocacy with public funding is that there's no entity that at its core, at least from a democratic principle, has the obligation and the responsibility to fund everyone in terms of, and especially those that like indigenous peoples and peoples of color, others that have been historically marginalized, that the call is there. So advocacy, I think, is incredibly important. What I would say with respect to now being in the wake of the pandemic, recognizing that many people are still suffering the results of the pandemic in terms of work and health, never waste a crisis, right? The pandemic, for example, so for Illinois designated $50 million in relief funding specifically for the arts, as much as it gave to restaurants, which is huge. They have a massive lobby. And what we need to show now, though, the opportunity that we have is to say, we called for funding. You gave us funding. First of all, say thank you to your rep. They don't hear a genuine thank you very often. So positivity does go a long ways. But number two, we have the opportunity to show that that investment worked. So if you received any type of relief, a PPP loan, a shuttered venue operators grant, anything, I really urge you, not just for advocacy's sake, but even for your own fundraising sake, to invite the legislator, invite the alderperson or the state rep who was behind that or part of that to your organization, get them to your events, get them to your activities, and say, this is what you made possible. This is the result of the investment that you did, and this is why we need more. Present what you're doing right now as a definitive case study, recent definitive case study on why funding for the sector and funding for you as an organization it works. This is a very unique opportunity to do that. And there is some momentum. I mean, the governor's budget, proposed budget, proposes a 65% increase in funding to the Illinois Arts Council agency. We're still, when it comes to per capita funding, would be outside the top 10 of states in per capita funding, but progress is being made there. But I would encourage executive directors and development directors to, even though this was one-time funding and it's drying up, it has to be obligated by the end of the year, to not necessarily give up on public funding. It's not for everyone, it can be bureaucratic, but to continue to at least be civically engaged with representatives and alderpersons and others to keep that door open to public funding. My kids go to our neighborhood public school. Our neighborhood public school had some massive capital improvements. Why did that happen? It happened because the principal over 2 or 3 years built a really good relationship with our state legislator, and they have funds available for capital that are in essence, at their discretion. So it pays off. If you're a development director, you might not think that you're an advocate, but as you said, Kerri, you are. I used to teach, I taught some graduate classes in nonprofit management, and part of it was dealing with advocacy and policy. And so I went to the person who was teaching the fundraising class, and kind of not as a joke, but as a trial, we switched PowerPoint slides. And I just took fundraising out and put advocacy in, and she took advocacy out and put fundraising. Totally seamless, like totally seamless. The skills are there. And then the last thing I would address importantly is that as a sector and as individual organizations, how do we message our case now? Because messaging, I think, is incredibly important. How do we make the case for arts funding? Certainly economics has always been part of the case. the economic argument in terms of the impact that you have on the local economy at this point is expected. It's not distinctive. And there's some healthy skepticism, as we've seen with the Bears stadium proposal, about economic numbers. There's some very healthy skepticism. So that might help, but it's not going to make you stand out with, at least with public funders. I think an important part of it is to show how you as an arts organization are helping make lasting change, even in quote unquote other issue areas. Are you as artists helping with the issue of homelessness, with violence prevention? There's been, of course, a long-standing, it's kind of a false argument, but between like arts for art's sake and arts for, utilitarian helping others. And there's been this kind of debate. But I would say, though, is that arts, and this is part of our message, can be a catalyst for change in those other issues. In chemistry, I'm not a chemist, but talking to chemists, in chemistry, a catalyst is a substance that makes a chemical reaction happen faster, but the catalyst is never consumed or destroyed. That's the definition. So arts being involved in violence prevention, it can help catalyze and change. That doesn't mean your art's going to be left out. The two can exist and have to exist. So how is your art and your organization impacting others? How is it presenting solutions, not just articulating the problem, which is key, but is it also catalyzing discussion that's being led by those who are being impacted around solutions? And then two final things, I think, in addition to kind of making systems change part of your proposal, thinking about lasting change, is that the arts can really create a genuine community engagement and agency that other areas don't necessarily do because of people's connection to the arts, and how they can voice themselves through the arts, and being able to make that connection, particularly in arts education, where students are still feeling the learning loss and kind of the emotional impact of being separated by a screen for so long. There still is a need, and the arts are very good at making connection. So those are some, I'm actually very interested in what other people think too about how we message the need for continued funding of the arts.
That leads, I was going to ask Chris and Monica to comment on that here as we wrap up and go into the Q&A. But that question of not just how you message, but also, make the case for the arts, or even, I was just saying yesterday to everyone how I'd been at a conference and it was like so much good, great speakers and so much information, and it's like inspiring. And then at the end, I saw these three young youth poets stand up in the corner and perform. And it was just clear that in your whole full body and the whole thing, it's like this feeling of the meaningfulness of all of it sort of came over me. It was like not my frontal lobe being more information. And it just really made me think about making the case for the arts at this time. And I'm just interested in, Chris, what you have to say following up on Jonathan there.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. That is, I think that's like the big challenge is for us as a field to like tell the story better of like the arts and the impact of the arts. We think about that a lot in terms of the funding for the literary arts. I mean, even just like moving towards like continuing to call it the literary arts, so that folks are reminded that it's an art form and they're artists, and it's not just, it's the misperception of like how arts get funded and the commercial viability of the arts, and like that is part of what we have to work against, and that the public doesn't necessarily understand what it means to be an artist, and that artists like often can't survive or like make a living like on their craft alone. And so I just think that it's going to take like a lot of continued just education, because as Jonathan mentioned, you know, this is about advocacy in like every sense of the word, like all of us as funders, as artists, as arts nonprofits, as advocacy organizations, like we just need to like kind of you know, like collectively like tell the story better amongst ourselves and to the larger public. So and that, I mean, I just think that's a challenge because of how the arts are thought about in this country, the ways in which they're undervalued, and yeah, and all of the kind of misconceptions that go with that. Also, you know, folks, this is just a personal plug, but you know, folks are more inclined, even though we don't have great arts education in our schools, you know, funders are more inclined to fund young people doing arts. And so, but like what happens to adults, you know, who for whom like being an artist is like, you know, their chosen career, like there's really like not a lot of opportunities then for like adults to continue engaging with the arts and with their form. And so yeah, that doesn't help. That's just kind of like more of like the sad situation. But I mean, I do think that, you know, I do feel like hopeful that like we as a community can like mobilize and change minds and about, like you just said, Kerri, like what you experienced seeing like young poets like addressing the same issues, I'm sure, and like having the same level of like sophistication in terms of their understanding of social issues and just expressing it in a different way, and in a way that's like impacts you on another level. So
That's really helpful. Monica, I'm going to come back to you because we're at 11 and I know people, you know, sometimes people fall after that. So I want to give everybody a chance to ask questions, and you can put that in the Q&A, or you can, I mean, put that in the chat, or you can just come off and ask. Is there anyone who wants to ask a question? If no one asks a question, I'm going to ask one that I have, which is, because I work in an advocacy and organizing space. And so something I'm interested in is if you know, if you realize that arts is a place where people are very moved and you recognize that you need to incorporate that into the work you're doing, how do you, you know, I guess this with Monica, like how do you go about partnering or looking for people, orgs in the arts who might think would similarly benefit from being involved with your work?
Well, actually, we have partnered with the Poetry Foundation. We did that last fall. It was a really fantastic event, and it was all Native poets. And we did a call out for poets that are emerging or just like on the younger end of things, and then also local poets that have been around for a long time. And it was just a really awesome event, just kind of, you know, figuring out like, okay, how can we, you know, still showcase some of our artists. So like our current artist in residence, she did like the poster and it was really cool and just had everybody's name. And she did like this beautiful screen print, Camille Billy. And you know, like Mark Turcott participated, Elise Passion, who is the daughter of Maria Tallchief, America's first prima ballerina, who also is Osage. So, you know, you're getting like these backgrounds and these stories, and then also creating these opportunities for these young poets to meet these more established ones, the ones that are like, yeah, they have these other perspectives, but then also hearing like, this is what younger generation is doing and, you know, how they're trying to move forward with the art. So, I mean, like sometimes kind of going back to what was said earlier, where it's intention versus like, is it utilitarian? And I think a lot of times for Native artists and folks, it seems that our art was limited to just being utilitarian. It's like, oh, just look at this and that, you know, and not necessarily see what's the depth, what's the evolution of the artwork, and you know how like the poetry has evolved and how people are utilizing language, you know, native languages in it, and just like the flow and the sentences and everything. So yeah, I think creating more opportunities like that, and then that can also partnering with organizations that don't necessarily always like focus on, these particular cultural groups. But it's broadening that audience, and people are getting like, oh, that's what they mean. Okay, I get it. Okay, and you start to see these similarities. So yeah, I'm a big push for collaboration. So yes, I put my email in the chat. So definitely contact us. We want to work with you.
Love that. Chris, from your perspective, like how did that come together for that partnership there?
Well, that's part of our programming team. So at Poetry Foundation, we have a lot of other things that go on here outside of grants. And so, but I know that, I'm sure that someone from Center for Native Futures got in contact with us and the programming team about wanting to have a partnership. And so we do, we have a building here in Chicago in River North, and we try to partner with folks locally as well as nationally. So yeah, and I think Elise also is part of a really other phenomenal group that we support through the grants program called Indigenous Nations Poets, and so they do amazing work mentoring young Indigenous poets, and which was based on a model that was started by Covey, which is a fellowship program for Black poets who inspired other groups to start, like Indigenous Nation Poets and Canto Mundo and Kundaman, and so Zooglossia. So I think I just want to plus one what Monica's saying about collaboration. I think also when we think about what's going to move the field, at least immediately, it is about collaboration and shared resources, and how can we, until we get to this moment where we're able to advocate for a lot more funding coming into the field, what kinds of things can we do in the meantime to make sure that the arts and arts organizations are able to sustain themselves. And we really think it is through collaboration and shared resources in the meantime. So
Absolutely love that. And we have a question. Marianthi says, I have a nonprofit production company, but securing grants has been a challenge when most grant organizations want to see what other grants the organization has secured. I am producing, hold on. Sorry about that. I'm producing a documentary on child refugees of the Greek Civil War. Any tips? Chris, you should take this one first.
Sure. I do think, sometimes it's not we do also ask what other organizations are funding. We just ask who your top 3 funders are, and it's not, and we say if you don't have any, it's fine, just leave it blank. And it's not necessarily for the reasons I think that you think you're maybe implying here. It's not because we want to see oh, yay, great, MacArthur and Mellon are also funding you. Actually, we're not less inclined, but we would rather see oh, this is a group that doesn't have support yet. And is this a place that we could then help give them the first grant that they're going to receive, or help get them off the ground? I think oftentimes if you're not able to provide support about other folks who are funding you, I think you could just add additional comments to make a compelling statement about why this particular funder funding you is really advantageous to the funder as well as you. So oftentimes funders want to be the first to help fund a project and to come on board. And so I think just trying to reframe that as an advantage, even though I know it doesn't probably feel like one to you, but and I don't think they're asking because some foundations might be asking because they're gonna be oh, well, why is no one else funding this? But I think there are a lot of foundations that's not their approach in asking that question. So
I just quick chime in. The Illinois Film Office is extremely active. The Illinois Film Tax Credit was recently expanded or renewed. Now, they mostly look at kind of larger commercial productions, but not necessarily. So you may have looked at them already, but I put the link in there. Take a look at the Illinois Film Office. It's a great group of people. Illinois is surging. It's one of the kind of gangbuster films. The Illinois is surging in kind of the film area. So I would reach out to them, even if they don't have programs that might support you. They may have some ideas. They're good people over there.
Awesome. Thanks, Jonathan. Justin, sorry I didn't see you, and Carl. Can you go ahead? Go.
Yeah, it's fine. I wanted to first put in a plug for Poetry Magazine, which is really marvelous. And Chris, I was very happy you mentioned the effort to expand the form. That's one of the things I love most about this magazine is every month I'm challenged by the forms that are in that in the issue. It's really, really, really good work. So everybody should subscribe. It's great. I don't have a question, I have a comment, which is we were talking a bit earlier about the frustration of a funder saying this is art, this is the kind of art that we fund, etc. And I would encourage us not to be discouraged by that sort of thing. I do grant writing for a community health center. And I've had this issue with funders as well. They will say, this is what we consider healthcare to be, this is what we consider this program to be. And I will write to them and say, actually, you're missing this piece over here that we're doing, which is really integral to what you're trying to accomplish. So if your goal is this, you're leaving out this. And so I think that's a really important framework to keep in mind, especially with the arts, because in this country, arts are only available if they turn a profit, if they can perform social work, or if they entertain. And there's so much more that the arts can do that we've got to push folks to understand why that is important. And finding that lane within a funder's work, I think is not impossible. So I would certainly encourage us to keep pursuing that.
That's a great comment. Thank you, Justin. Carl?
Hi, thank you so much, Carl Evans. Hope this isn't too unwieldy of a question, but try to be concise here in that the scenario I want to pose is there was an artist in San Francisco who had an ongoing installation around a paintworks they had done, oil paintworks around past 5-6 years around work with their family's BIPOC history as watermelon farmers. And they recently got their funding pulled because the watermelons become politicized in all things are political, obviously. But so my question is, unwieldy as it is sort of asking back to you all, is there seems to be an unusually unique chilling effect sweeping across a lot of places, the corporate spaces, and now into the nonprofit world. And I guess I'm just sort of putting it out to you for artists who, whether they are directly aligned in political topics or it's just the nature of their work. Individual Selena Lee, and she just used the concept of watermelons to make pictures of the Golden Gate Bridge or whatever, you know what I mean, and things like that. So I just throw it back to you. What are your thoughts on, just as we're seeing a very abnormally, legislation saying certain things about what you can say with your speech and art. So that's where I'll leave it.
Monica, or you, Chris, or anyone want to respond to that?
I think right now we're seeing a lot of fear, but that's also just, when do we not? There's always something to be scared about. But yeah, it's unfortunate to see when people misconstrue or conflate certain things to say like, oh, this is obviously aligned with such and such, or like rainbows are for everybody, right? Right now. So I think we're just going to have to kind of ride that wave out a little bit. But I mean, as long as you're still pushing for like, well, you know what, you're like that artist, she knows what her intent is. And if that does happen to align with certain things, well, I think we're also seeing certain places show, their true colors. Also, I think again, it's just like going back to that fear mentality. I mean, it's such a hot topic right now that people are afraid to talk about it, but how can we move forward if we don't talk about it, if we don't create safe spaces for us to talk about these things openly? We're just not going to get anywhere. So I think that's also the beautiful thing about art. It can also instill certain things with people where, hey, maybe they don't want to talk about it, but they can see it, and that does still affect them, still sticks with them. I'm married to a musician, and actually his father is also a musician, but they kind of pointed out like that's the only art form that is so intrusive, where it's just, like you can't necessarily block it out, like you're going to hear something. of it, and whether you want to or not. But you know, I think that's also kind of the really cool creative thing with arts, that it can reach people on these other levels and really get them to think, you know, just more critically. And I really hope that we see more pushes for that. And yeah, I hope that artists just keeps going with their work.
Chris, you brought up the DEI stuff earlier. We have another question, but I just wanted to know if you want to touch on that in relation to Carl's questions and kind of threats around that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, like Monica's saying, we're just seeing a lot of, you know, I think we're just seeing a lot of like unfortunate like suppression of free speech and censorship that's like happening like in this moment. And I do think, you know, whether that's, I don't know if like that funder was like a corporate funder or a government funder, but you know, I think that's one of the ways in which private foundations should really be like stepping up and like making sure that those artists are funded, because when it comes to like government or corporate funding, like those are the first that are going to get like pulled in instances like that. And so for foundations to then make a commitment to making sure that like you know, artists are like protected and able to like do their work without the fear of a loss of funding. So yeah, I would just advocate for that.
That's helpful. I wanted to just go up here. People are giving some great information in the chat, and development practitioners are really good at doing that. But a question came up about organizations that offer grants for theater. Does anyone, I mean, Jonathan, you've been talking about people coming back, but not, I mean, is that something you'd want to speak on? Sure.
I think there are some great opportunities that were put in the chat. So I think that essentially covers it. Some of those private foundations, I think, are good sources. Also, I think someone rightly mentioned the Illinois Arts Council Agency, DCASE, are all ones that you should definitely look into. The trend, and I think it's a good one, hopefully it keeps going, is the call to have more arts funding actually go to arts organizations and to artists in grants, not wrapped up in other things in terms of public funding at the government level. So, but yeah, I would definitely refer to the chat. Good comments there. Can I sneak in two other things?
Absolutely.
So I mentioned advocacy, and sometimes it's easy to get cynical about advocacy, about what can really change. I think there's two changes that have occurred as a direct result of advocacy from the arts community, and I just want to call people's attention to that. The first is the governor signed shortly after last session what's called the Illinois Freelance Workers Protection Act. Artists were involved in arguing for that. It's based on legislation that was passed by New York City. Illinois is actually the first state to do a state version of that. It provides very basic, not strong enough, but still very basic protections for freelance workers. And of course, that's a big part of our sector. So the law, for example, makes it mandatory that there be written contracts. It makes it mandatory that that for certain situations that payment be made within 30 days or be explicitly stated when it would occur in the contract. So certain basic but very important protections are now enshrined in Illinois law. And so just want to make people aware of that. If anything, I think COVID showed the arts advocacy community that it's not doing a good enough job advocating for individual artists, for individual creatives. Out of the sector the subsector within the arts community that was hit the most, in many ways, it was individual artists, and we need to support their interests more. The Illinois Freelance Workers Protection Act is a tiny part of that we need to build on, but it's something. The second thing I would mention is, it's one.
Can I just stop you for 1 second? I'll come right back to you. I just want to. I see Mike has a question, and I'm going to come back to you for sure.
Yeah, no problem.
Mike, go ahead.
Oh, sure thing. Appreciate you all for making space today. My name is Mike Pope. I'm a development consultant representing the League of Chicago Theaters, Reading Between the Lines, Forte Community Music Project, and a few other arts organizations. Um, two questions. First is, we primarily exclusively work with BIPOC and LGBTQ leaders who are doing work in those communities. One of the things we struggle with sometimes when applying for arts funding is how to communicate that when there's not a certain initiative, there's not a certain, rally that we're doing behind any of these things. They're just inherently built into the work that we do. And then second, Chris and Monica both mentioned building strategic relationships with funders and getting to know those funders and cultivating those relationships. I know the answer, but could you share a little bit more about how to do that? I think that's the thing that's sometimes missing is more specifically from Monica, would love to hear how you've gone about creating those relationships. And then Chris, I would love to hear from a funder, how do you appreciate those relationships being presented to you?
What brings people together better than food? Like share meals. Yeah, I mean, it's so simple, but it's also like that does get people kind of out, like a little bit more comfortable, feeling safe and everything. And yeah, I mean, I think we've also, the way we have our organization arranged, we don't have a hierarchy. It's like we're co-directors. When you come into the space, you see we're working like out in the gallery, so we're accessible. So yeah, kind of creating those environments where people are going to feel comfortable. And yeah, just like open communications, like any good relationship, it's always about those open communications. And, you know, even if sometimes you're like, why would they do that? Like if you can have like a good enough space with that person or where they feel like, yeah, you can address certain things. So I think it's gotta be okay with being a little uncomfortable sometimes. And I think that's, but ultimately, I mean, if you can share and laugh and just, I think ultimately we're trying to all do some good work out here and really push for, these arts our artists and creatives, have this space. I think that's just all part of it.
Yeah,
Thank
I would,
Chris, go ahead.
yep. I just, in response, like, I think people should just like email, in terms of like reaching out and saying like, would you be open to having a conversation? We're always open to having a conversation with potential applicants and folks who want to apply. I think, because it's good for us to like, even though we're not the immediate decision makers, we take recommendations from, the external reviewers, but I think that it's helpful for us just to be able to communicate with folks about like, this is really what the priorities are. We're always happy to say if someone presents to us like, hey, do you think this project would work? We're happy to be honest and be like, we don't think that's like a good fit for us. But, then we're also willing then to like give recommendations for other funders who we think might be able to help, and then or to like keep it in mind if we hear about other funders that or able to connect folks with other funders. Like we want to do that. And so I always, we have kind of like a general grants email that we like are always monitoring, and that's available on all of our web pages. So I would encourage, I mean, it's obviously different from foundation to foundation. Like some folks don't want to meet with folks, some people do. So, but I think it's like worth the ask for sure. That's like what we're here for, to like get to know applicants and to try to help applicants and to give guidance. And so I think it's like worthwhile to reach out. And it doesn't have, I mean, it could be just like a 30-minute Zoom, or, it doesn't have to be anything like too elaborate in the beginning. But yeah, I like talking with folks and like hearing what folks are working on, and it helps me also just get a sense of what's going on in the field. So, and then just really quickly on that first point that you made about that the work that you're doing is like, BIPOC and LGBTQIA led and like serving, and it's like baked in everything. That kind of goes back to what Jonathan was saying earlier about like, that's what foundations want to see. And so sometimes just like, don't take for granted that that's like, that that's what you do, but you kind of still have to spell it out to foundations, because, they are looking for folks who are like doing the work in a very intentional and, like holistic way. And so whatever opportunity you can take within the application to just spell that out for them, I think it's helpful. It doesn't have to be like some kind of new initiative. In fact, like funders want to support people who've been doing the work pre 2020. And so, I think just making that really clear in the application, however you can. So.
And then one thing that's changing a bit, I feel like there was a bit of overcorrection. The sort of arts funders were like, just tell us what you do. And I think in those spaces, it was hard to try to fit in these diversity, equity, inclusion things that are built in without just for no reason bringing it up. And so I'm finding that more and more funders are, asking more appropriate questions. But I guess my main concern was if there aren't those appropriate questions, when is the best time to bring that up? Is it in the first paragraph? Is it in, you know what I'm saying? If there's not that space for it.
Yeah. And I think even as you talk about like what you do, like what informs what you do and like what it's built upon is like always something that you could include. So, even if they're just like, what activities are you doing? Always frame it in terms of like, we come from like a lens, like an equity lens in order to do this and this program. All like our staff and the folks that we serve are like BIPOC and LGBTQIA. And I think like however you can like kind of fit that in so that it's part even of like just describing your programming. It's like, it's what informs the programming. It's what's at the foundation of the programming. So I think just finding creative ways to work it in wherever you can to like re-emphasize that. So, because reviewers are always looking for that. Like that's like something, because they can see like reviewers don't want to see anymore when people are like, we know we need to like get more people of color on the board. They're like, it's 2024. If you do not have people of color on your board, like quit saying that you're working towards that. Reviewers are like not having that anymore. So I think like that's what the reviewers are looking for, the things that you want to say. And so I would add it in however you can.
Yeah, just piggybacking off of that real quick. If they ever offer to say, hey, if you have any questions or want one-on-one, take them up on that. And so, because they'll spell out certain things. This is what we're looking for. Those are the keywords. And then if you can get that in your grant to be like, here, bullet point, like they'll even take that, especially grant reviewers. A lot of people don't like to read. Unfortunately, I know it's awful, but people don't always like to read. After you can get to the better.
That's great advice. Well, we're coming close. I really appreciate you covering the questions of people asking these questions, which are so helpful. And I am going to let Jonathan close us out. Jonathan, with the big picture lens there.
Oh, just really quickly, there's another positive change. If you're an arts nonprofit or any nonprofit, you used to, if you had a charitable contributions more than 300,000, you had to do an audit every single year. That was required, and that's expensive. A law did change. This kind of was my pet project. I loved it. Forefront was a key leader. If your charitable contributions are between 300 and 5,000, you no longer have to do an audit every year. You do not do an audit this year. No, you do an audit. It's whatever you can do, but you only need to do a financial review. And so there's raising funds. There's also not spending funds you don't have to. So that's a positive change. In terms of the bigger picture, it's hard for me to summarize all the good things that have been said. It's been an honor to be a part of this with Chris and Monica and you, Kerri. I would just say and defer to others, but just thank you to the people who are on the call. As I think Carl who noted it's a tough environment. It's tiring after the pandemic. It was tiring before. In many ways, the arts are under attack. But what you as artists and arts nonprofits are doing when you get up in the morning is phenomenal. And I don't think that you will ever truly know all the people that you are influencing in a life-changing way. You probably never will. But you certainly are. So it's keep up the good work and thank you for doing it.
that's an awesome place to leave it. And I'm sure you can get in touch with these folks. They put their emails in the chat, and this is being recorded, so you can go back and grab links. Thank you to everyone for being here today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
There's